Hey everybody, welcome to Example of Play. In this video, I'm going to be taking an in-depth look at Burden of Command and talking to you about why I think it is a really unique experience that takes bits and pieces of mechanics and ideas from a lot of different games and combines them in a way that is totally new. I don't think I've ever played a game that does what this game sets out to do and what, after playing about a dozen hours of the campaign, what I think it succeeds in doing. The game bills itself as a tactical leadership RPG, and I don't know any game has ever called itself that before, but this game does what it says on the tin. If you just look at a couple of screenshots, you're going to see the tactical side of it, and it's going to look like a standard traditional hex and counter war game. You got 2D units moving around on a map with a grid, and most of that's going to seem familiar and old school. But what this game does that's novel, what it does that sets itself apart, is that it does the leadership RPG side of it. It gives extreme level of context to every decision you make on the battlefield. There are conversations before the battle, after the battle. There are decisions that pop up during the battle that are unexpected, that give you opportunities or risks or things that you just have to make a decision. And that's the leadership RPG side of it, that you're constantly making choices and you don't always know, there's not always a right answer. Sometimes there's just a decision to be made. And as the leader, it's up to you to make that decision and live with the consequences. If you enjoy games like XCOM or Fire Emblem or Jagged Alliance, games where if you play it the way it's meant to be played on Iron Man mode, where losing a unit has consequences, every decision you make has a consequence because you can't go back. This game is like the ultimate version of that, where it's not just fantasy units or soldiers fighting aliens. It's a game that is like Band of Brothers, the RPG. It is just oozing with authenticity. There are elements in between the battles where you get context, where you see real photos, interviews with veterans, things like that, that just lend a weight to your decisions and to what you're doing. And the writing is done in such a authentic manner that it just gives you a heavy sense of responsibility, which is really an interesting thing for a game like this that seems so simple at first, but the more you play it, the more you feel connected to all the characters, the other officers that you interact with, their units that you've been leading since boot camp, and you've seen them over and over. And whenever you get into a battle, you might have to decide, do I push these guys forward to try to accomplish the objective? Do I hold them back so that I don't risk them unnecessarily? And sometimes you're not always sure what the right answer is, and you have to live with the consequences. And I think that is what really makes this game really cool and a really unique experience. And I can't emphasize enough that you should not save scum when you're playing this game. It will tell you that. It will give you one old save on the previous turn. So if you can fix something, if something really goes wrong, like mechanically, like the game crashes or you just click the wrong button maybe. But I would highly, highly recommend, if you play this game, do not save scum. You will just be robbing yourself of a really unique experience if you do that. All right, so having said all that, I'm going to step through some different aspects of the game in a little more detail and show you some gameplay footage from further into the campaign. So there's a demo, you can play the game yourself right now. It covers boot camp and then a few standalone scenarios from later in the war. And so you can get a real taste of the game for yourself, because it'll take you several hours to play through what's in the demo. I've been fortunate enough to get the preview version of the full campaign. So I've put about 12 hours into it. I've played through boot camp and then through the next arc of the story, which is Operation Torch, invading North Africa and actually fighting against the French, which is kind of an interesting scenario that you don't see a lot in war games. The game follows a historical unit, the 7th Infantry Division, part of the 7th Infantry Regiment, part of the 3rd Division. They're called the Cotton Balers. And so again, it lends this authenticity to what you're doing, because you're following this historical unit through the real places that they went and some of the real missions that they faced there. So the first thing I want to talk about is the RPG side of the game, because I think this is what really sets it apart from other games that look like it. And this isn't just a war game or a tactical game. This is a role-playing game. And the role that you're playing is that of a lieutenant in the U.S. Army in the early part of World War II. You're part of a historical unit, the Cotton Balers, who were a regiment in the 3rd Infantry Division. And so you follow along with where they really went in the war, which again lends some authenticity to what you're doing and some context to it. As a lieutenant in your unit, you're one of several officers. There's a captain over the company, and then there's 4 platoons, each led by a lieutenant. And so all of your other officers are these fully fleshed out characters because leadership is what this game is about. And so you see these other guys who each lead their own platoon and each have their own personality, their own background. And the way the RPG is done for the most part is through text, through conversations, dialogue choices. Obviously, this game is not a big budget game. There's not fancy cutscenes or a lot of voice acting or anything like that. But there is some really excellent writing and some really excellent presentation with some great artwork that I hope you'll see in the video here. A lot of these illustrations are amazing. Like, it makes it feel like Band of Brothers, the RPG, because you're seeing all these visuals. There are like photographs, images of like real after action reports from the war, things like that, that really give it a lot of flavor and put you in this role. You feel like, you know, this is a historical context and not just a game. But the way that you make decisions is kind of like a choose your own adventure thing. You're presented with a scenario, a dialogue, and then you choose how your character reacts to it. But your choices, sometimes they're just for flavor. Sometimes they're just to give your character personality, which lets you make different dialogue choices later. But a lot of times they do carry some kind of consequence. Sometimes it's minor. It's like, do I want to get a little bit of an experience point bonus for these guys or a little bit of trust bonus for these guys, which is important, which adds up because mechanically part of the game is how much do your men trust you? How experienced are you? That factors into the tactical side of it, where say you order an infantry squad to rush across the street and attack a machine gun position. Well, if in the RPG side of it, you've built up trust with those guys, they're more likely to follow your order because every time you ask them to do something dangerous, it's going to do a morale check. It's going to see, are they willing to do the thing you're asking them to do? Because sometimes you'll give an order and they'll refuse. And sometimes it's because you've given a really bad, dangerous order. And sometimes it's just because, you know, they're human beings and they're not always going to do what you order them to do. And so there's a lot of things mechanically you can do to increase your chances of success. And then there's a lot of things you can do on the RPG side of it to build towards that to be more successful later. So a great example is early in the boot camp part of the campaign. You're between missions. So I should say first, these choices pop up all the time. So between missions, you get like a ton of choices where you're talking to people, you're talking about the next mission, you're getting context for what's going on. Sometimes you can get bonuses for the next mission depending on what choices you make in between. During a mission, stuff pops up all the time. Sometimes it's just for flavor. Sometimes it's just little things that don't necessarily matter what you do. And sometimes there's like huge choices where you don't know exactly what the consequence of what you're deciding will be. You're kind of going into the unknown, which again, that ties back to the don't save scum in this game because you'll just ruin it for yourself. It's much better to just live with your choices as you go. And then, but back to the example. So in the boot camp, like there's one part where you're going between one training mission to the next, and you're presented a choice of you're marching. You can see that your men are tired. And do you want to let them rest? Do you want to push them on? Usually these aren't just option A and B. Usually you have several choices and there'll be kind of a spectrum of results from that. And so a lot of times your choice will either increase the men's experience points, which the more experienced they are, they get veteran status as you go, and that makes them more effective. But also you want to build up their trust. So the more that they trust their leader, the more likely they are to do those dangerous things. And so both of those kind of combine together. So you kind of need both of them. And so there's not necessarily a right or wrong choice. You can take care of the guys, let them rest, and they'll gain trust in you. They'll like you more, or you can push them on harder, and that might make them like you a little less. It might make them be tired in the next mission, but it might give them more experience points so that they're more effective later on in the campaign. And so there's not like necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's more of like, what kind of officer do you want to be? And I can say that this game authentically presents a lot of situations like this that are based on real life, that if you've ever been a military officer or any kind of leader like that in the military or in many other contexts as well. You have to decide things like, hey, am I aloof with the men? Am I friendly with them? Am I buddy buddy so everyone likes me, or am I kind of a stoic leader that gets the job done, that gets respect that way? You can choose. You can be kind of a jerk sometimes. You can be really nice. You can be indirect versus direct. There's a lot of choices, and you're not really like locked into one thing or another. You can kind of it's like on a spectrum, so you can kind of push yourself in one way or the other. You can be kind of the guy who's always sarcastic and joking around, or you can be the yes sir, no sir, always by the book. The game lets you play the kind of role that you want to play. And a lot of this ties back into you're always balancing the men versus the mission. So you get scored every scenario. Usually the men side of it is how many casualties did you take? Did you keep them to a minimum? And then the mission side of it is, did you accomplish the objectives you were given? And there's like minor defeat, major defeat, minor victory, major victory, or a draw for each of those. And then you'll get points from it. And then those points you'll need, they kind of feed back into level, like the game mechanic side of thing of leveling up your squads, leveling up your officers in different ways that make them more effective. Or sometimes you need those points to replace losses and to reduce stress on your guys, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute. But the RPG side of it, you are also playing the side of being an officer where you're dealing with, you've got orders coming down from above, and it's kind of up to you to decide, am I going to try to do everything that my superior officers, that command is asking me to do, no matter what? Am I going to take the risk of not accomplishing the mission because I didn't want to take too many casualties and bear with whatever consequences come from that? And this is a game where you can lose a mission and the story keeps going. There's no resetting. Again, there's no saves coming. Like if you lose a mission, you just lose it and go on to the next one. You didn't accomplish the objectives and you just have to live with that. Or you took a lot of casualties and you just have to live with that. Or maybe things went great, which sometimes, if you play well, things will go well for you. But it all ties together and you're always kind of balancing these two things. You do have stats that you gain with higher command. So you do what they want you to do. You get these prestige points, which you can use. And then if you kind of take care of your men and think about them, you get loyalty points. And then those are points that you use to kind of level things up. It's your resources that you spend between missions to build up your units. But beyond just the game mechanics part of it, it's really an enjoyable experience because so many of the other characters, the other leaders that you're interacting with are these fully fleshed out characters. So like the other platoon leaders there's 3 other officers with you or more later that each have their own personality, that are each their own fully fleshed out character. And then you also have, sometimes there's privates that you talk to, they pop up here and there and you kind of follow their story. There's your senior NCO who's with you all the time, who's giving you guidance. Sometimes you can defer to him and be like, what do you think? Sometimes you can be decisive. There'll be so many little hints of things of not everyone's going to agree with what you want to do all the time. Sometimes you'll be right. Sometimes you'll be wrong. It is a very authentic experience in that way of like you're interacting with these other people who are, fully fleshed out people in their own right. There's one more mechanic that's part of this. Your officers can get different mindsets. So this is how mechanically they can gain like some passive perks, or they gain perks, some of which are passive, like different bonuses. And then they'll get just a handful of like special abilities. So if, for example, with my character, I took, there's 8 different mindsets you can take, but you can't take all of them. You have to kind of decide which ones you want to focus on. So I took idealism as my main one, and the special ability that gives you is that once a battle, basically, you can stand up and expose yourself to fire to like rally your men, which is something that real officers have done in real battles. It carries a risk that you could get wounded, or you could get hit for sure, but it does have this effect. But you can only do it like once a battle. So it's not like a special power that you can do all the time. It's like a thing that a real person might have really done every once in a while. And that ties into the RPG side of it, of what dialogue choices you make will push your character and the other officers in these directions where they get these different perks over time as the campaign goes on. And I could keep going on about this for a while, but I'll leave it there. You kind of get the idea of how it works. And I just would reiterate that everything that comes up is really well written. there are just all these little small moments that don't always carry a huge significance, but they make it feel like a more real experience. And really, I would give more examples, but I feel like I would be spoiling the game, which is a crazy thing to say about a war game. Um, I'll just say, a lot of things that happen are things you would kind of expect to happen in a story about a war. But a lot of them are just little moments that don't appear in most other games, but are things that could happen in real life. And so, yeah, again, I don't want to spoil it. I just want to say the game is just chock full of these little moments. They pop up all the time and they really add to the experience. So, having covered the RPG part of it, we'll move on and talk about the tactical war game side of it, the gameplay of actually moving guys around on a map and doing the fighting. And so, in this game, if you look at it at a glance, you're going to see, okay, this looks like a 2D hex encounter war game. So, if you've played those before, you'll have a good grip on the basics of it, but also it throws in a lot of mechanics that are specific to this experience. That you'll learn over the course of the boot camp section of the game, but you'll want to really pay attention to what the game's telling you. It tries really hard to explain it to you, but the first time I played some of these missions, I struggled because I was in the wrong mindset. So this is a game where you're not going to win through just having your guys shoot at their guys and inflicting casualties. Inflicting casualties is relatively rare, actually, and so you'll fire at the enemy and you'll usually just suppress them, and then they'll take cover and get down. And unless they're exposed or you have like a really heavy weapon, you're usually not going to inflict too many casualties just having your squad shoot at their squad. And so the way that you need to win is to learn the 4 F's of infantry combat. So find, fix, flank, and finish. And that means you need to figure out where the enemy is at. You need to fix them in place by shooting at them so they're suppressed. And then you need to maneuver one of your elements to get close, flank them, get in close, and then finish them with a close-in assault. And that is the way you will eliminate 95% of the enemy units on the map are going to be eliminated by you doing a close assault. And that's just the nature of the game, of the combat that this game is portraying. And you might every once in a while eliminate an enemy unit just by shooting at it enough, but usually that's not going to happen unless you've got like tanks or heavy artillery or something like that. The other part of the tactical portion that sets the game, makes it a little unique, is the turn structure. So I'll try to explain it. It's a little hard to explain without just playing the game yourself. The boot camp section does teach you this, so be sure you pay attention, because if you don't understand it, you're going to really struggle with the game. But the way the turn structure works is on a turn, there's multiple phases, and so the phase can go back and forth between you and the enemy. But during each phase, basically only one platoon of yours can be active in that phase. So for example, a scenario, you've got 2 platoons and you decide, okay, I'm going to move this squad from platoon A. Now each unit has an individual number of actions per turn, and each officer has an individual number of actions per turn. So for that squad to move, the officer leading it has to spend one of their actions, or the game calls it orders, has to spend one of their orders to activate that squad. And then that squad independently has how many actions it can take. So at the beginning of the game, each squad can do 2 things on a turn, but as they gain experience points, they like level up, they get more actions. So eventually they can have like 4 actions, which is really powerful. But it always costs your squad leader 1 action to activate them. So the squad leader also has some special abilities and things they can do, like rally the men or bolster them for an attack or do some other things. And so you have to decide how that officer is going to spend their actions. Are they going to move their whole platoon? Are they themselves going to move? It's kind of a balancing thing. And then you're also balancing, okay, which platoon do I activate first? Because if I activate Lieutenant Smith's platoon, then Lieutenant Baker, he can't act until you give the enemy the turn back, or give the phase back to the enemy, so they get to act. So you have to decide, well, what do I need to do first? And you can even go back and forth multiple times. So you might move one specific unit, they're in the open, you need to move them to cover, and then you give the phase back to the enemy, then it comes back to you, and you go to the other platoon, and you can exhaust all their actions in one go if you want to. It just depends on the situation, what you're trying to do. The other twist is that the captain, the captain is leading the whole company. He's kind of like a wild card. He's kind of like the queen in chess. He can do everything. So he has some additional special abilities. He can activate a unit from any platoon. He can do this kind of independently of what else is going on. He can rally soldiers from a hex adjacent. He doesn't have to be in the hex with them like the lieutenant does. So like your captain can rally multiple units in one turn, without even moving, versus your lieutenant who has to spend his actions to move around to do that. So the captain is like really, really powerful, but also there's just one of them. And so you got to kind of decide where you're going to spend those extra actions at. But once you understand it, the turn structure is really cool, because it, again, forces you to make these decisions of what am I going to do first? Who am I going to have act? If one of your officers is suppressed, like his morale drops because he's getting shot at, he's going to be ineffective. Like he loses, if any unit is suppressed, they lose how many orders they have in a turn goes down. And so you got to figure out how are you going to get that guy to cover? How are you going to rally him and get him back in action? Because it's his whole platoon becomes ineffective if he only has like one order on a turn. Basically, his whole platoon can only do like one thing. And so it ties, again, the leadership is like a huge focus of this game, both on the RPG side and on the tactical side of your platoons are not effective unless their leader is with them and directing them and joining them in combat to make them more effective at the front.
We gotta do this.
The scenarios that you face as you go along are varying. Generally, you've got the same core force most of the time. So your infantry, riflemen, a very standard arrangement where you have the 3 platoons of rifle squads, and then you have 1 platoon that's your weapons platoon. So they have 2 squads of machine guns and a mortar. So you have a very standard loadout of stuff that you would again, historically authentic. You don't get a bunch of you don't have like a sniper or special units like that, at least not as far as I've played into it. But you do sometimes get like tank support. You do sometimes get heavier artillery that you can call in, things like that, which feel all the more special because you don't always have them available. So like there's some missions where you get a whole platoon of Stuart tanks that join you, even though these are just light tanks, where in some other war game they would be the weakest units out there because they're like light tanks. Who cares about them? In this game, where it's a more authentic experience, that platoon of 4 Stuart light tanks is incredibly powerful. Can really supplement your force and provide them with a ton of fire support and make your mission a whole lot easier if you can roll them up and have them just shoot with impunity at enemy positions. But at the same time, you have to be kind of careful with them. If you get them destroyed, they're gone. So like even the leader of the tanks that shows up, it tends to be this recurring character that you meet in boot camp, and then he shows up again later. So that's part of the narrative of like how you interacted with this guy, pops up multiple times. But if you get stuff like that, it just feels really powerful because you're usually kind of limited to your standard riflemen and what you're doing with them. But that also means you have to learn to be effective with what the tools that you've got. And so the scenarios, generally you're, at least in the first campaign, you're usually on the attack. The enemy is out there. You got to find them. You got to close with them and suppress and destroy them and move on to your objectives. But the maps vary quite a bit. As you expect, some of the first maps aren't that big. And then you get to a map and you think, oh, this is a lot bigger. This is a tougher objective. And then you get to the next map and you're like, oh, this is a lot tougher. Now you're facing multiple layers of defense. You're facing artillery pieces or anti-tank guns that are firing at you from really far away that outrange all of your weapons. And you got to figure out, like, what am I going to do about this thing over here that's shooting at me that I can't really counter? And the answer is, well, you're going to need to avoid it sometimes. Like, you're just going to have to maneuver your guys where it can't see them. Just like a real infantry officer would be like, well, we can't go through the open. We can't go that way. We've got to find a path through to close with the enemy without being exposed to fire. And that's like part of the tactical portion of the game, is figuring that out. And part of the narrative is your fellow officers, a lot of times they'll suggest different courses of action. So you go into a scenario and they might say, hey, one's going to say, hey, we should do this. The other one says, hey, we should do that. You can agree with one of them. And that might build your rapport with that person versus the other one. Or you might ignore both of them and do your own thing. And so it kind of puts the pressure on you, because a lot of times you're forced to make a decision because you're put in the role of the leader. You're forced to make a decision, and then you'll have people kind of side eye and you like, you sure that's what we want to do? And it feels kind of real of like, no, this is what we're going to need to do. And sometimes I click that button of like, no, this is what we're doing. And then I immediately think, oh, what if I'm wrong? What if it all goes sideways and I was so adamant about it? And so I think that the narrative tying back to the tactical portion of the game is really effective and really makes it Just like I said, it gives like just such a high level of context to what you're doing. Where in any other war game, it might be mechanically interesting, it might be a really cool scenario as far as the map and what you're doing, but here it feels more personal. Like your guy is down there on the field that you're playing as, and the other people around you are all these characters that you've kind of like learned to know. And every time you send them forward into danger, you're like, that's someone I've had all these conversations with and everything. So it really adds to the experience. There's also a lot of like really great touches. So like whenever you move up guys, sometimes you'll see little text pops up on the map, like things like, oh, a dog is barking, or you hear someone crying in the distance, or a child runs and hides behind a building or something like that. And this stuff, it doesn't change things necessarily. It's just a little flavor, but it again just adds more narrative to it, makes it feel more personal. It's these little realistic touches that you don't always see in other games. I remember in Into the Breach, it did this, where sometimes you'd see little text bubbles pop up of like, oh, they're here to save us, or oh no, we're about to die. And in this game, you have these little realistic little things that just pop up, or your guy's just griping, like, what are we doing? Like, why is he sending us here? And they'll react to the things you tell them to do, which is, again, just adds so much feedback to what you're doing beyond what a normal war game would do. All right, so now I've been gushing on and on about the game. So to be objective and give you the full picture, also present a few flaws with the game or a few areas for improvement. Kind of three things I had. One is that the UI, the game does teach you how to play. It has videos, it has pop-ups showing you where all the buttons are, what you're supposed to do. But I felt like there was still times where with the UI, I wasn't 100% clear, like why I could or couldn't do something, or why my odds of doing something were much higher or lower, depending on different factors, because it presents you with a lot of information, but it's not always totally clear of like what's important, what matters. But as you play the game, like by the time you finish boot camp, you'll understand enough to know how to do everything. But it's a little muddled, like, or just sometimes like you mouse over something and you'll see like different text boxes pop up, and they might cover each other up, or they might be inconsistent. It felt like sometimes of like what information was presented to you, what was driving, what was an option or not. And then the other thing was that performance-wise, it's like a 2D war game. Seems like it should run perfectly smooth, but sometimes it feels a little sluggish, especially like in the bigger scenarios where you have a lot of units. It feels like the game is calculating things as you move the mouse around sometimes. Like I select, especially it felt like with one of the scenarios where I had a bunch of tanks, I selected one of the tanks and it can move like way further than the infantry. And it felt like as I moved the mouse around, it was thinking really hard, like it slowed the game down a little bit. So that's probably something that can be polished and improved a bit. And then also sometimes the turn resolution of like the AI acting, sometimes it's really quick, sometimes it's really long. It's like it thinks for a long time. Just again, felt like kind of that could probably be improved over time, but it's not like none of that's like a game killer. It's just kind of could be a little smoother. And then the other thing was that I did have a few crashes to desktop. So there were a few points where the game just crashed, or like I tried to load back into the game to continue playing and it would crash. And then in a few cases, I was forced to not save scum. I pinky promise I still took the same actions, but I was forced to load the save from the previous turn. So the game always has like a current save and then like one turn back. And I think that's mostly just there in case something like that happens where you run into a bug or something. You can load one turn back to keep playing. So I had that pop up in the 12 hours. I had that pop up like 3 or 4 times, which is more than I would like to see. But I was able to send in a bug report each time automatically. So hopefully they get that fixed once they have more people playing the game and seeing those bugs pop up, they'll get them squashed. The only flaw I really have on the gameplay side of things, and this is probably due to the first part of the game, you're doing boot camp, and then in Morocco, you're fighting these French forces who aren't very motivated, so they're really easy to suppress. Basically, you just need to shoot at them once or twice, and they're kind of done fighting, which is tracks historically. So I'll be interested to see if this changes when you get into the later campaigns where you're fighting the Italians and then the Germans. But sometimes the forces so far playing against felt kind of static. They do move around sometimes. There are a few points where they counterattack, and those situations are a little hairier of like, how do I deal with the enemy is coming at me? Because most of the time in the scenarios I've played so far, you're on the attack and the game is you picking, kind of figuring out what the enemy defenses are, what they look like, and then picking them apart and tactically maneuvering to eliminate those enemy positions one by one so you can get to the objectives. Versus you're never like on the defense in the other early part of the game. There's no waves of attacks coming at you except for just a few points, where those points I did not handle very well because I was not ready for like an entire enemy platoon to come at one of my squads. And like, what do I do? Because you don't do that very often. So it'll be interesting to see, especially like, I'm sure when you get to the fighting against the Germans, that they're much more motivated squads, much harder to suppress, and much more aggressive. So that'll be something to see when you get to that point. But gameplay wise, the early part, you do get different scenarios. The geography of each scenario is different. What you're trying to do varies, and what kind of obstacles come up varies. But a lot of times it is like you're facing sort of static enemies that you suppress them and then finish them off. And then sometimes they'll retreat. Sometimes they can't retreat because they're already pinned down. But that was just kind of one theme I saw in the gameplay. So having said all that, in conclusion, I think you probably know how I feel about the game. I think it is unique. It is really well done. It's been years and years in the making, but I think this final product is something that will please people who are wargamers for sure, people who are fans of military history, and even people who are just tactics gamers. Like if you're like someone who loves XCOM, like there is something for you here, or Fire Emblem. You know, you like the parts of talking to your people on your team and like building them up and then leading them into battle. Like this is that, but in a very realistic World War II setting. And if you're one, or you're someone who, just likes RPGs, somehow found your way to the end of this video, I would recommend giving it a shot, because the game, it has a long boot camp. It teaches you how to play the game, how to be the leader of a rifle platoon in World War II, at least in the context of this game. So it's easy to recommend to anyone who likes those kind of things, because it does all of that stuff. And then also it's really easy to recommend because they recently announced the price on release. It's only gonna be $20, which I feel like is a steal for this game. I would, if they had said it was $40, that would have been pretty reasonable. I feel like $20 is a bargain bin price for a really great, unique game. So that makes it easy to recommend as well. And then if you're still not sold, there is a demo. So you can check out the demo, and it is several hours worth of content. It goes all the way through boot camp, and then it has some standalone scenarios so you can play some later war stuff with more experienced squads and see what that looks like too. So yeah, in conclusion, highly recommend this game. I haven't finished it, like I said, but I've played 12 hours of it. I've played through the whole first 2 arcs of the story. And if the rest of the game is as good as the first parts, easy to recommend. I think I can give this game my highest form of praise, which is that I think about it when I'm not playing it. As I was getting ready to do this video, I played through the scenarios over a few days, and I was always eager to get back and get into it and play it some more. And that's, not very many games, lots of games I look forward to playing, but not very many games am I actively thinking like, I can't wait to get back and play this and see what happens next, because the scenarios are all interesting. The story is interesting. You're just wanting to see like, what's the next challenge? Like, what is the next thing that's going to come up? And again, final reiteration, but don't save scum on this game, because I was tempted to a few times when I first started it. Even in the boot camp part, there are little things you'll do where the game tells you, hey, do this. And it'll give you some hints like, oh, here's some context of what you're doing. And then it'll say, here's your objective. And if you take the most obvious route, or you just do the most, you do act without thinking, the game will punish you for it. Even in boot camp, it'll be like, wow, I can't believe you did that. That was really stupid. But that's teaching you early on when you're in boot camp and no one's dying. Teaches you lessons that you need to know for later, so that you don't do those dangerous things in the real war, which I thought it works narratively, it works mechanically. It's really cool. And so the game is just chock full of stuff like that, of just, it feels authentic, I guess is the final word for the game. The presentation, the artwork, the videos, the interviews with veterans that pop up between some of the missions, all that stuff, it just builds up this experience that is really, I don't know, it's just different from other war games. It's different from other RPGs, because it's in this context of something that really happened and lets you play a role in that context, which is really cool. So Yeah, that's enough from me. You know how I stand on the game. I think it lives up to the expectations, and I highly recommend it. So, I didn't really set out to make this a review, but I guess it feels like a review by the end of it. But yeah, highly recommend Burden of Command, coming out really soon and only $20. So, I would say go ahead and go get it when it releases, or check out the demo and play it for yourself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye.